Friday evening, the 8th of May 1987. The village of Loughgall in County Armagh holds maybe 200 people, a few streets, a Church of Ireland spire, fields running out to the hedgerows, and a small Royal Ulster Constabulary station that most days sees almost no trouble. At approximately 7:15 in the evening, the sound of a diesel engine breaks the quiet. A mechanical digger turns onto the approach road, moving slowly, with roughly 200 pounds of explosives packed into its front bucket. Behind it, a blue Toyota Hiace van follows at distance, carrying 8 men armed with AKM assault rifles. The East Tyrone Brigade of the Provisional IRA had been planning this for weeks. They had chosen the station at Loughgall carefully, a soft rural target, lightly defended, symbolic. They drove in, believing the element of surprise was theirs. The SAS had been waiting for them. Security forces were pre-positioned inside the station itself, inside buildings on the perimeter, and lying in the fields surrounding the approach before the IRA unit ever reached the village. There was no reactive scramble, no last-minute redeployment. They were already there. When the digger reached the station and the bomb detonated, destroying approximately half of the building in a single sustained blast, the men who climbed out of the Hiace stepped into a prepared killing ground. Soldiers fired more than 600 rounds. The IRA got off 70 in return, hitting no one in uniform. All 8 IRA men were killed. Every one of them died from a head wound. A civilian named Anthony Hughes, a 36-year-old Catholic father of 3, was shot dead when his car drove along the road behind the attack at precisely the wrong moment. His brother Oliver was hit 14 times and survived, losing a lung. Anthony's widow received an out-of-court settlement. His family campaigned for 27 years for a full account of how he died. Loughgall was the IRA's single largest loss of life in one incident across the entire duration of the Troubles. The men who died had names and ages. Patrick Kelly was 32, the East Tyrone Brigade's commander. Declan Arthurs was 21. Seamus Donnelly was 19. Michael Gormley was 25. Eugene Kelly, Gerard O'Callaghan, Patrick McKierney, all dead in the same station yard on the same evening without a single British soldier scratched. Loughgall sent shockwaves through the Republican movement. It traumatised the IRA's support base in East Tyrone in ways that took years to recover from. The British press called it a triumph. The army called it a success. Almost 10 million intelligence documents relating to that one operation exist somewhere in British security archives. That figure was confirmed in 2016 legal proceedings brought by survivors' families. 10 million documents. For an ambush that lasted less than 3 minutes. An operation of that precision doesn't happen by accident. You don't pre-position a special forces unit inside a rural police station on the exact night and at the exact hour that an 8-man active service unit arrives unless you know the plan, the route, the timing, the personnel. Signals intelligence can give you fragments, a phrase intercepted here, a pattern observed there. Surveillance can give you movement patterns. But what happened at Loughgall required something more specific than either. Someone with access to the attack's internal planning had talked. Someone who knew not just that the East Tyrone Brigade was active in that area, but who the men were, what they were driving, and when they were moving. How British forces acquired such precise operational intelligence remains a matter of deep suspicion within Republican circles. The security forces never said. The questions have circulated for nearly 4 decades, and they have always pointed in the same direction. The unit tasked with running the source responsible wasn't MI5. It wasn't the RUC's special branch. It was a covert army intelligence organisation so determined to obscure its own existence that it deliberately varied its name in official correspondence. Force Reconnaissance Unit in some documents, Field Research Unit in others, Forward Research Unit in a third, specifically to confuse journalists attempting to track it. Its real name was the Force Research Unit, the FRU. A British Army Intelligence Corps operation established around 1980, reporting directly through the Army chain of command, with a mandate to recruit and run agents inside paramilitary organisations in Northern Ireland. This distinction matters and must be held clearly. MI5 is the civilian security service, national remit, strategic focus, operating at remove from the operational ground. RUC Special Branch was police intelligence, local, constrained by criminal procedure, answerable in theory to civilian oversight. The FRU was the army. It operated with a counter-insurgency posture that was more aggressive, more morally flexible, and far less accountable to civilian audit than either of the other agencies. It ran agents simultaneously inside Republican and Loyalist organisations. It tolerated serious violence from its sources when the alternative was losing access to intelligence it considered irreplaceable. Former FRU officer Ian Hurst, who spent years after leaving the unit working with journalists to expose what it had done, described the internal atmosphere in terms that are unambiguous. Agents were recruited and run with the understanding that there were no rules and no borders. One academic analysis of the period characterized the FRU as having become a force within a force. The third Stevens inquiry, which eventually examined the unit's conduct, identified its defining institutional features as collusion, the willful failure to keep records, the absence of accountability, the withholding of intelligence. Sir John Stevens had begun his Northern Ireland investigations in 1990, concluding collusion was neither widespread nor institutionalised. By 2003, after 3 separate inquiry phases, he reversed that conclusion entirely. The FRU's most valuable asset was given the codename Stakeknife, deliberately misspelt from steak knife in early newspaper stories to provide some cover to the source. His agent number was 5027. His real name was Freddie Scappaticci. He was born on the 12th of January 1946 in the Markets area of South Belfast, a working-class neighbourhood with enough Italian immigrant families that locals sometimes called it Little Italy. His father, Daniel Scappaticci, had come from Italy and built a small ice cream business in the city in the 1920s. Freddie became a bricklayer. At 14, he trialled with Nottingham Forest as a footballer, went home to Belfast after 3 weeks with homesickness, and by his mid-20s was embedded in the Republican movement. He was known for a short fuse. Contemporaries remember him as someone who was feared rather than liked. Ricky O'Rourke, a former IRA member who later wrote a full account of his career, recalled that no one had a good word to say about him. In August 1971, during Operation Demetrius, British forces interned Scappaticci without trial in Loughgall as part of a sweep that took hundreds of Republican suspects off the streets in a single night. He stayed there until 1974. His time in internment deepened his connections to the Provisional IRA. By the late 1970s, he was an active member of the Belfast Brigade, a recognisable figure in Republican circles, moving through the network with the confidence of a man whose loyalties no one questioned. Sometime around 1978, reportedly after a beating administered by a fellow IRA member following an internal dispute, he made contact with British military intelligence. British handlers, who later spoke to reporters, described Scappaticci as having walked into their arms on a Belfast street approximately 25 years before his public exposure in 2003. Whatever grievance drove him out of the IRA's orbit and toward the British, the army took what he was offering. The FRU didn't yet exist when that first contact was made. The unit was established around 1980. His earliest handling, therefore, predated the organisation that would become his primary controller. When the FRU became operational, it assumed his case. And around his case, it built something exceptional, a special internal subsection referenced in Operation Canova's findings as the rat hole, created specifically to manage the extraordinary secrecy surrounding his identity and to add an additional layer of separation between him and any oversight structure that might demand accountability. Both MI5 and RUC Special Branch were informed of his recruitment. At various points, each attempted to take over his handling. The FRU refused both, retaining primary control, while MI5 received what the Canova final report would later describe as automatic sight of all Stakeknife intelligence. Throughout his active years, Scappaticci met his FRU handlers approximately every 7 to 8 days. That meeting frequency was confirmed by Operation Canova's investigation. From Margaret Thatcher onwards, successive prime ministers received regular intelligence briefings drawn from what he produced. John Butcher, who eventually led the Canova investigation, was given full access to every cabinet paper related to Stakeknife intelligence that any prime minister had seen since the late 1970s. The intelligence produced by that relationship was considered irreplaceable. That was the justification that circulated internally, the argument that the FRU and its chain of command used, to themselves, to their superiors, and in whatever private moments when the accounting might have pressed on them, to explain what they had permitted. His position inside the IRA gave him something no other source in the conflict could match. One former IRA member, cited by the BBC, described his unit as the Clapham Junction of the organisation, because everything went through it. He was a senior figure in the IRA's Internal Security Unit. The Internal Security Unit. The IRA called it by several names: the ISU in Internal Documentation, the Security Department in Internal Conversation. But everyone in Republican Belfast called it by the name that explained what it did: the Nutting Squad. The name isn't a metaphor, it's a method. The BBC confirmed the etymology in plain terms. Informers, uncovered by the unit, were shot in the head, the nut, and their bodies dumped along rural border roads after interrogations that involved extended physical abuse, sleep deprivation, psychological pressure, and recorded confessions. The recordings were often later played to the victim's family as proof of treachery. Then a single shot to the back of the head. The body left in a ditch or on a roadside, hands sometimes bound, eyes sometimes taped. This was the IRA's counterintelligence apparatus. Its formal purpose was to identify British agents operating inside the Republican movement, break their nerve through interrogation, extract confessions, and execute them. Freddie Scappaticci was its senior operational figure. The structural inversion at the centre of this story requires a moment's full attention, because its implications radiate outward in every direction. The man the British Army had placed at the apex of the IRA's internal security architecture was simultaneously the organisation's chief spy-catcher. The person Republicans trusted above all others to find and destroy British agents was himself, at every moment and throughout his entire operational career, the most consequential British agent in the conflict. He was the lock that was also the key. He was the fence that was also the gate. Every suspected informer who surfaced inside the IRA, every name, every accusation, every order for interrogation, passed through Scapatici's hands. He had absolute discretion over who was investigated rigorously and who was absolved. He chose which accusations escalated to execution and which ones quietly died. He used the apparatus of Republican counterintelligence to protect sources the British wanted protected, to silence individuals who were getting too close to the truth about his own position, and to eliminate internal rivals under the bureaucratic cover of security work. The Nutting Squad was, in this reading, less a spy-catching operation than a managed cull, with the British Army holding the criteria for who qualified. Operation Canova confirmed that this is exactly what happened. The investigation found that the unit sometimes accused people of being agents because its members wanted to eliminate rivals. The mechanism was available, the outcome was terminal, and the accusation required no external verification, only the authority of the man making it. Some of the people killed during Scapatici's tenure were falsely accused. They weren't informers. They were killed because someone wanted them dead, and labelling them as traitors was efficient. Some of the people the Nutting Squad killed were genuine British agents, informers working for other handlers, sacrificed to maintain the credibility of the man British intelligence had decided was worth more than they were. The BBC's profile of Scapatici states the consequence without qualification. He has been linked to at least 18 murders, all committed while he was on the state payroll. Some of the victims were fellow agents. Frank Hegarty had been an IRA member from Derry and a covert British agent whose information led directly to the discovery of an IRA arms cache. When his cover was blown, he fled to England. He was persuaded to return to Ireland with assurances of safety, assurances that didn't hold. He was found dead on a roadside in County Tyrone in late May 1986. His hands were bound. Tape covered his eyes. He had been shot once, in the head. Investigators, including author Henry Hemming in his book 4 Shots in the Night, have alleged that Scapatici directed or participated in Hegarty's killing. That allegation has never been judicially proven. But Hegarty was a British agent, killed by the IRA's internal security unit during the period when Scapatici ran that unit, while Scapatici was meeting his army handlers every 7 to 8 days. In 1990, a man named Sandy Lynch was seized from the streets of Belfast by the Nutting Squad. Lynch was an IRA member from the Ardoyne area, who had also been working as a police informer. He was taken to a house, tied, blindfolded, and interrogated. Scapatici told him, according to the BBC, that if he had his way, Lynch would be hung upside down in a cowshed and no one would hear him squeal as he was skinned alive. The interrogation went on. The confession was extracted. The execution was being prepared. The security forces raided the property before it could be carried out. Lynch survived. He gave sworn court testimony, a formal deposition entered on October 29, 1990, identifying Scapatici by name as one of his interrogators. He entered a witness protection program and never returned to Belfast. His testimony is one of the very few pieces of sworn evidence in the public record that places Scapatici directly inside a Nutting Squad operation. The Lynch rescue effectively ended Scapatici's active service. The IRA, already suspicious by 1990, stood him and his unit down. He was moved to the Irish Republic, where he spent approximately 2 years before his position became untenable. His FRU handlers had lost their primary asset. But the pattern of operations his intelligence had enabled, the architecture of access he had built over more than a decade, didn't disappear when he left. Caroline Morland was 34. A Catholic mother of 3, abducted in July 1994, held for 2 weeks, interrogated, made to record a confession, and shot dead near Rosley in County Fermanagh just weeks before the IRA's ceasefire. Her daughter Shauna was 10 years old when it happened. By the time Operation Canova examined her case, Shauna was an adult seeking a single piece of information. If her mother had been an informer, why hadn't the state, which would have known, intervened to save her? The answer is the same answer that runs through every case in the Canova files. The intelligence pipeline was the priority. The source's cover was the priority. The question, "Do we stop this?" wasn't formally asked, because asking it would have forced an answer that threatened the asset. The official justification for running a source like Stakeknife has always rested on the accounting of lives. The claim that hundreds of lives had been saved was the FRU's internal moral framework. It was repeated in various forms through every internal review that touched the operation. It was the argument that convinced successive governments to keep the briefings classified, keep the files sealed, keep the asset in place through all of it. Operation Canova systematically dismantled that accounting. The Canova Interim Report, published in March 2024, and the final report, published in December 2025, both concluded that intelligence attributable to Stakeknife saved between high single figures and low double figures of identifiable lives. Not hundreds, fewer than 20, set against 17 murders and 12 abductions that Canova submitted to the Public Prosecution Service for consideration. The investigation's verdict was unambiguous. It was probable that more lives were lost than saved as a consequence of his continued operation as a British agent. MI5 knew what he was doing throughout. The Canova final report is explicit on this point. The service had automatic sight of all Stakeknife intelligence, and therefore was aware of his involvement in serious criminality. Following the report's publication, the Director General of MI5 apologised for the service's disclosure failures during the investigation itself, when it emerged that relevant material had not been handed over for years, despite specific requests. MI5 had found additional Stakeknife material in spring 2024, after Canova's investigation was essentially complete, and after the PPS had already made decisions on prosecution files. The timing was, to put it carefully, inconvenient for the families who had waited decades for that material. There was no formal written doctrine that explicitly authorised Scappaticci to kill while on the state payroll. What the evidence describes is something more institutionally convenient. A deliberate pattern of non-intervention, a culture of non-recording, a system in which the question of whether to stop a killing was never formally raised, because raising it would have forced a formal answer. The third Stevens inquiry named this culture precisely: the willful failure to keep records, the absence of accountability, the withholding of intelligence. Not an explicit license. A structured silence that produced the same results as one. Ian Hurst, the former FRU officer who published under the name Martin Ingram and spent years after leaving the unit fighting injunctions, prosecution attempts, and a burglary of his home in which an early manuscript of his book was seized by parties who then presented it in a London High Court hearing, wrote in 2004 that acquiescence in murder does not deserve to be protected as a genuine secret. He was describing the institution he had served. He was describing a decision made, repeatedly and without formal record, at the level of command. To let the intelligence keep flowing. and to not ask what was happening in the rooms where Scappaticci's unit worked. The FRU's commanding officer through the peak operational years was Gordon Kerr, known in official inquiry documents only as Colonel J, though investigative journalists, NGOs, and human rights organisations had identified him by name decades before any official report acknowledged it. Kerr later served as Britain's defence attaché in Beijing. Victims' groups demanded he be questioned. He wasn't prosecuted. Return now to County Tyrone and the pattern the East Tyrone Brigade's losses make when you place them in sequence. The brigade was one of the IRA's most capable rural units. Experienced volunteers, difficult terrain, a support network embedded in the local communities of Kappa, Pomeroy and Carrickmore. Between 1987 and 1992, it suffered 3 catastrophic pre-positioned ambushes, each one requiring advanced intelligence that went substantially beyond what cameras and radio intercepts could reliably provide on their own. Loughgall, 8th of May 1987. 8 dead, including the brigade's commanding officer. Soldiers pre-positioned before the attack unit arrived. County Tyrone, June 1991. 3 IRA members, Peter Ryan, Tony Doris and Lawrence McNally, killed in an SAS operation. A coroner's ruling in 2024 found the use of force legally justified. The operation required knowledge of the specific vehicle being used and the movement pattern of the specific individuals involved. Clono, 16th February 1992. An East Tyrone unit attacked the RUC base in Coal Island using a stolen truck mounted with a heavy machine gun, carrying out the assault before withdrawing. Within minutes of that withdrawal, minutes, not hours, they drove into a waiting SAS ambush at St Patrick's Church in Clono, where 4 men died, among them Peter Clancy and Kevin Barry O'Donnell. Forces News later confirmed the key detail. Intelligence had shown that the unit was preparing an attack using a stolen truck with a heavy machine gun. The security forces knew the vehicle type, knew the method, and had pre-positioned before the attack on Coal Island even began. 3 catastrophic operational losses in 5 years. 3 pre-positioned kills, each requiring specific foreknowledge of personnel, timing and method, not pattern analysis after the fact, but pre-positioning before the attack commenced. One ambush can be attributed to an exceptional intelligence break, a lucky intercept, a single source at the right level at the right time. 2 ambushes strains that explanation. 3 ambushes against the same brigade across the same 5-year window that coincides with Stakeknife's active operational period describes something structural rather than fortuitous. No official inquiry has attributed all 3 to a single intelligence source. Operation Canova was explicit in warning against over-crediting Stakeknife with any specific operation. The intelligence picture in Northern Ireland was genuinely layered. Multiple agencies, multiple agents, surveillance, signals intercepts, informants at different levels feeding a common result. Pinning any single ambush to a single source, in the absence of declassified intelligence records, is an inference rather than a finding. But Scappaticci sat at the node through which much of the IRA's internal security intelligence flowed. His unit handled queries from across the organisation, from brigades seeking security assessments of their personnel, from officers concerned about operational breaches, from volunteers under suspicion who needed to be cleared or not. His position gave him unique access to information across the IRA, not just the Belfast Brigade, but the wider security architecture of the organisation. What entered his unit's awareness reached his FRU handlers within days, at a meeting frequency of every 7 to 8 days, sustained across more than a decade. A 2019 documentary account reported that Scappaticci was himself entrusted by the IRA to investigate how the British had obtained advance warning of the Loughgall attack. If accurate, the implication is complete. The IRA's internal security chief, tasked with finding the source of the intelligence leak that destroyed the East Tyrone Brigade, was the man who represented that very intelligence pipeline to the British Army. Scappaticci was British intelligence's biggest asset for 15 years. If it was an informer who had these men from the East Tyrone Brigade set up to be killed, the entire weight of the documented record points to him. His access, his active period, the frequency of his contact with handlers, the pattern of catastrophic losses that runs through exactly the years he was operational. No other figure in the conflict occupied the same position, with the same reach across the organisation at the same time. The official record won't certify that connection in those exact terms. What it supplies is everything around it: the architecture of access, the handler relationship, and a final verdict from Operation Canova itself, a highly placed and valuable agent who provided significant intelligence on the IRA, operating under state protection while committing serious criminality, in a relationship the investigation concluded cost more lives than it saved. Close enough to name. Too classified to certify. Operation Canova was established in 2016. John Butcher, then Chief Constable of Bedfordshire Police, was brought in to lead it at arm's length from any Northern Ireland-based structure, an external investigation, staffed by approximately 50 detectives from outside the province, with no one on the team carrying a military or intelligence background. The independence was structural, not incidental. The PSNI requested the external inquiry because of the case's scale, size, and complexity. The investigation ran for 9 years. It cost approximately £40 million. It executed 12,000 investigative actions. More than 300 people were interviewed, 40 under caution. Canova built access to records that had not been provided to any previous investigation, including, eventually, the cabinet papers detailing what every Prime Minister from Thatcher onwards had been told about Stakeknife. Butcher read the full intelligence file of a man who had been the British state's most protected secret for 3 decades. The Canova interim report was published in March 2024. The final report followed in December 2025. The files submitted to the Public Prosecution Service covered 17 murders and 12 abductions linked to Stakeknife's sphere of operations between 1979 and 1994. 60,000 pages of evidence, the majority of it classified intelligence material. No one was prosecuted for any of it. Scappaticci was arrested by Canova officers in January 2018. He was 72 years old. The only charge that resulted from any legal contact between Freddie Scappaticci and the British justice system was a conviction at Westminster Magistrates Court in December 2018 for possessing extreme pornographic material found on a laptop seized during the Canova search. He was described in court as wearing a grubby blue fleece and green tracksuit bottoms. He told the magistrate he suffered from depression. He received a 3-month suspended sentence. Magistrate Emma Arbuthnot told him, "You haven't been before the court for 50 years, and that's good character in my book." Kevin Winters, a solicitor representing many of the victims' families, said after Scappaticci's death that the cynical view before he died was that there was never going to be any prosecution, and now he is gone, there is no doubt. Greg Harkin, who had worked with Ian Hurst to publicly identify Scappaticci in May 2003, beating a series of government injunctions, said plainly, "I never believed there would ever be a court case. There was no way Freddie Scappaticci was going to appear in a court of law and be prosecuted for anything he had done working for the British." The PPS declined prosecution on every Troubles-related file. Former FRU handlers, retired army officers, intelligence officials who had known, documented, and continued operating the arrangement for years. The investigation that consumed 9 years and £40 million and 60,000 pages of evidence closed without a single criminal conviction for anything that occurred during the Troubles. Butcher, by the time of the final report's publication, having become Chief Constable of the PSNI, called for both the British government and Republican leadership to apologise to victims' families. He urged the government to officially name Scappaticci as Stakeknife, describing his crimes as the worst possible. The government declined. Its stated policy remains neither confirm nor deny. In February 2026, Irish Taoiseach Micheál Martin named Scappaticci as Stakeknife in the Dáil. The British government hasn't followed. Freddie Scappaticci died on the 20th of March 2023, aged 77, of natural causes following a serious stroke. He had lived for 20 years in England under a new identity, the name Frank Cowley, changed by deed poll in January 2020. He relocated multiple times as death threats arrived from the Republican community, whose members had known his name since 2003. He reportedly took holidays in the Canary Islands with his estranged wife. He was, The Guardian noted, a wealthy man. On the proceeds, the paper characterised it, of his treachery against the IRA and a tax scam that was popular among the organisation's senior members. His father's funeral in West Belfast in 2017 brought Scappaticci briefly back to the city he had fled. He appeared, was recognised, and left. He carried it all to the end with denial intact. He wasn't Stakeknife. He wasn't a tout. In 2025, the High Court in London ordered his will to be sealed, ruling that public inspection would be undesirable or inappropriate. He died without being charged with a single Troubles-era offence. The Canova final report's conclusion on his identity, for all the official circumlocutions, contained its own verdict. Claims that Scappaticci was Stakeknife were, it found, almost universally treated as true. Canova had established that Scappaticci himself told his wife and a female associate that he was Stakeknife. The British government's continued refusal to formally acknowledge this was described by the report as having a severe impact on victims and families, legitimate public debate, media freedom, open justice, and public confidence in state authorities. The policy of neither confirm nor deny, designed to protect intelligence sources from exposure, had been stretched to cover the posthumous reputation of a man who was dead. The secrecy had outlasted the secret. The IRA's spy-catching unit existed to defend the organisation against infiltration. From the moment Freddie Scappaticci assumed a senior position within it, it became the infiltration. The Nutting Squad identified and killed informers. But the ones it identified and killed were the ones the FRU was willing to lose, or found useful to lose. It protected the ones it wasn't. It silenced, through the IRA's own paranoid internal mechanisms, anyone who got too close to the truth about what was actually running the apparatus. People who were entirely innocent were killed under false accusations. People who were genuine British agents were killed alongside them. And the man directing that process, meeting his FRU handlers every 7 to 8 days, producing intelligence that reached every Prime Minister from Thatcher onwards, was the IRA's most trusted guardian against exactly that kind of penetration. The men who died at Loughgall believed the IRA's internal security architecture was working for them. Patrick Kelly, 32, commanding the East Tyrone Brigade, had no reason to doubt it. Declan Arthurs, 21. Seamus Donnelly, 19. They had been members of one of the most experienced rural units in the conflict. They drove into County Armagh on a May evening, believing their operation was secure, that their route was clean, that no one had talked. They had no way of knowing that the system designed to guarantee their security had been, throughout its existence, the system that compromised it. The Force Research Unit, not MI5, not the RUC, the Army, ran this operation across more than a decade. It built the rat hole around its most valuable source. It resisted every attempt by other agencies to assume control. It maintained a meeting cadence of every 7 to 8 days throughout the years that the East Tyrone Brigade was suffering its catastrophic losses. It briefed the country's most senior political figures on the intelligence that arrangement produced. And when Operation Canova finally assembled the documentary record of what the arrangement had cost, the prosecutorial threshold was found very by the institutions that had run the operation to be unmet. Ian Hurst wrote in 2004 that acquiescence in murder does not deserve to be protected as a genuine secret. He was describing the institution he had served and the people he had worked alongside. The institution hasn't yet fully acknowledged what it did. The IRA's most feared enforcer was a British agent. The organisation's primary defence against infiltration was the instrument of infiltration. The most consequential British spy of the entire conflict was the man the IRA trusted most to find and eliminate British spies. 10 million documents related to Loughgall alone remain in British security archives. Most of them are still classified. Freddie Scappaticci went to his grave as Frank Cowley in England in March 2023. The men he was supposed to be protecting from went to their graves decades earlier, in a station yard in County Armagh, on a back road in County Tyrone, on the ground outside a church in Clonaux. Their families waited for an accounting that the British state, with considerable institutional determination, declined to provide. The file isn't closed. It was never properly opened. Subscribe for more stories like this.